In July 2011, all of Mexico stood still as they watched a video of cartel workers Felix Gamez Garcia and his uncle Barnabas Gamez getting dismembered with a chainsaw. Cartels are known for their extreme violence, from getting beaten to death to being burnt alive. Here are some of the most brutal cartel execution methods. El Guiso, the stew. January 22, 2009, one of the most wanted criminals in Mexico, Santiago Meza Lopez, was captured by the Mexican army in the Baja Seasons neighborhood of Tijuana, in a house where he had been partying too much for several days, commonly known as El Pozolero, which means the pozole maker. He was known for being a special cleanup agent for cartels, and he's believed to have stirred and dissolved over 300 bodies in acid at his Ensenada ranch about 70 miles south of the border. He gained notoriety for being among the first to pioneer the El Guiso method. El Guiso basically means the soup, and basically you put a person into a large oil drum and then you fill it with gasoline or acid before setting it on fire to create a furnace used to burn victims, most commonly referred to as making guiso or stew. The originator of this technique remains unknown, but a few Mexican cartels have become infamous for using this preferred execution method. To prepare this deadly concoction, you fill a huge barrel with water and then concentrated sulfuric acid, causing it to boil and spit dangerously hot liquid. Once it's ready, victims will be dunked in while they're still breathing. And this insane method of torture would put these victims through excruciating pain, ultimately leading them to a slow death. Born to poor parents in mid-April 1964 in Sinaloa, Mexico, Santiago Meza Lopez struggled with poverty from a very young age. At 13, he would work construction until the 90s, where he moved to Tijuana in search of a better life, until his sister was raped by members of a criminal organization. Seeking revenge, Lopez joined the Tijuana cartel through his childhood friend El Teo. As time went on, Santiago eventually climbed the ranks, and a few years later, his efforts finally caught the attention of the boss, Efrain Perez. One fateful day, Perez entrusted him with the grim task of disposing bodies, offering him a weekly payment of $600, and that's where it all began. He would liquefy his victims in a very effective and unique style. He would dunk the cadavers in a tub filled with acid and sodium hydroxide while stirring the bodies. You'd keep this mixture on high heat for at least 8 hours, until the bodies finally disintegrated. Certain parts of the body don't get dissolved, like teeth or nails, maybe even small pieces of bone, which Santiago would eventually throw into a wasteland, burn them a second time with gasoline, and bury them. Authorities say he'd claimed to stuff over 300 bodies into barrels of lye, then dumping some of the liquefied remains in a pit on a hillside compound in eastern Tijuana. After his arrest, investigators found about 14,000 remains buried in his ranch. The choice of name for this extremely violent execution method begins to make sense, seeing how the torture technique is centered around cooking victims. According to reports, when Santiago was being interrogated, he claimed to have tried to escape from his former boss, Efrain Perez, an ex-member of the Arellano Felix cartel or Tijuana cartel, but none of his attempts were successful. Lopez claimed to have been recruited while working on a farm in 1996, where senior members of the Arellano Felix cartel asked him to carry out an experiment with water and acid in a barrel. Lopez said he had no choice and he was forcibly recruited, as they threatened him with violence to carry out these acts. Whether or not that's true, no one knows, but the fact remains that he did this for many years until he was finally apprehended. In 2012, he was initially sentenced, ended only 10 years, and was eligible for release in April 2022, which angered a lot of families in Tijuana. However, on February 5, 2024, his prison sentence was increased by an additional 30 years. The El Guiso method became a favored tool among high-ranking cartel leaders to kill their rivals and traitors. Its gruesome efficiency was unmatched, with victims bound by their hands and feet as to fit in an oil barrel more easily while still conscious. The chilling legacy of this method serves as a stark reminder of the ruthlessness in the world of organized crime. Food for the pets.
They often torture and kill their victims. They have fed some of their victims dead and alive, to tigers belonging to the Chapitos.
Since the 80s, rare, dangerous, and exotic animals have been used in a way to show off insanely high levels of wealth. But over the years, cartel bosses have adopted another insane tradition. Just like Pablo kept hippopotamuses and other exotic creatures at his private compound, rare and dangerous pets are still a status symbol today for high-ranking members of the Mexican cartel, imitating the infamous Colombian drug lords of the 80s and 90s. It was a means to show off and send threats, as it looked like the more dangerous a cartel was, the more dangerous pets had to be found in their homes. Mexican authorities would later tell you that these animals weren't just for showing off. Sometimes cartels would throw their unfortunate victims in these enclosed areas, with starving apex predators. In the most wicked way, the cartel would have their victims beg for their lives in fear just moments before being torn apart by these wild animals. And one of the people that employed the use of this torture method was a cartel boss known as Heriberto Lascano. Born in poverty on Christmas Day in December 1974 in Hidalgo, Mexico, he joined the military at the age of 17, serving in the elite special forces, dedicated to fighting guerrillas and drug trafficking organizations. He served in the army for 7 years, and then deserted on March 27, 1998, when he was recruited by Ociel Cárdenas Guillén and Arturo Guzmán de Sena to join Los Zetas. Heriberto, aka Z3, and El Lasca, was one of the most wanted Mexican drug lords of our time. According to authorities, he was the master at torturing his victims. He became known for using this method known as La Paleta, and this would involve a victim being stripped naked and brutally beaten with a board. Reports also say Lascano tied a man to a tree and severely beat him until he broke his legs, and then to top it off, he left him tied to that tree for about 3 days, until he died. Lascano had a ranch with a lot of lions and tigers, and was particularly known for killing his victims by feeding them to those wild animals. Although he didn't starve these animals, he would keep them hungry enough for when he had a victim for them to devour. He said he was fascinated by the way his pets tore apart their bodies. He enjoyed watching the process of torturing his victims, and would laugh at their pain. Now, the general process was that he would force these people into a cage and allow an audience to view the proceedings. Unfortunately, he never got a taste of his own medicine. Instead, he was killed in a 2012 shootout with Mexican military officials. Flaying. Summer of 2018, a video popped up online that shook Mexico, revealing a horrifying and unsettling scene. Filmed in the hills of La Unión, near the border of Costa Grande and Tierra Caliente. It featured a gruesome murder of a father and son by members of a Mexican cartel. 2 men were tied up, made to kneel on the ground, having their mouths gagged and their hands tied tightly. The captors questioned the older man, beating him with what looked like a large wooden stick. The violence inflicted upon him was unimaginably horrific. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, the father was beheaded right in front of his son with a small knife that looked like a pen. The most heartbreaking scene in this video was the son's reaction after seeing his father die. The shock factor in his tears moved the whole nation. The fact that the father chose not to fight against his captors was somewhat shocking. It appeared as though he had accepted his fate, perhaps as a result from the trauma from previous beatings, or from being paralyzed by the severity of the situation. After they took out the father, the son had to go through a much longer and more agonizing ordeal. The captors would cruelly flay his chest with knives. During this gruesome act, the son remained conscious, drifting in and out of shock. The video shows just how far these cartels would go to ensure that every part of their operation ran smoothly. In 2010, Guzman, or El Chapo, made headlines after he recorded a video of himself using the flaying torture technique as he beheaded a member of a rival cartel, Hugo Hernandez. El Chapo, with a chainsaw, flayed Hernandez, and then he ordered his soldiers to stitch the cut-off skin on a ball to add to his warning intended for the Juarez cartel. Hernandez's torso was found in a plastic container, and the rest of his remains were left on the streets of Los Mochis as a chilling message to El Chapo's rivals. With their special knives, they would meticulously strip the skin from their victims, or resort to peeling their faces off with other sharp objects. Amidst agonizing screams, the cartels have honed their proficiency in this barbaric practice, knowing how to keep victims alive for prolonged suffering, reserved for the most egregious offenders, like rival cartel members, double agents, and thieves. The sheer brutality of flaying someone just shows you these guys aren't messing around. How you can inflict such unimaginable pain while these people scream for their lives is way beyond us. Dermatologists have noted that the typical causes of death due to flaying are shock, critical loss of blood, or other bodily fluids, hypothermia, or infections. They stated that the actual death is estimated to occur from a few hours up to a few days after the flaying. If this isn't dying hard, we don't know what is. Dismemberment. In 2015, Texas law apprehended Marciano Chano Millan Vasquez, an alleged hitman for the Los Zetas cartel, involved in this 2013 kidnapping of a former drug trafficking associate. Now, this associate was testifying against Vasquez, claiming the cartel assassin took him to this undisclosed location, where Vasquez was keeping his family of 3. In his words, when the hitman removed his blindfold, the drug associate saw a couple and their daughter standing near a flaming barrel. According to him, Vasquez and other members present forced the parents to watch as Vasquez dismembered their daughter with an axe. It's not only Vasquez. A lot of people in the cartel execute their victims through grievous acts of injecting them with either morphine, adrenaline, or heroin, which would affect their central nervous system and make them stay awake through the process, and then would make the use of heavy, sharp blades and sometimes even kitchen knives to chop off the victim's limbs completely. Throughout the torture, these members would avoid cutting close to vital organs to keep the victims in agonizing pain for much longer. The combination of blood loss, infections, and shock from extreme pain is the perfect torture cocktail to get people ready for the pearly gates. These poor souls have no choice but to give up whatever information they're withholding, and more often than not would die from the pain. It's a case of killing 2 birds with 1 stone, putting the victim through a slow and agonizing death as well as making the body disposal easier. In some cases, the body parts are left in public areas to serve as a message, threatening those who go against the cartel that put it there. A well-known example, October 2010, Israel Ricon, a cartel member, wasn't just murdered, but was dismembered for killing the son of one of El Chapo's allies. When El Chapo got his hands on him, he had him tortured until he fell unconscious, but he had a doctor on standby to make sure he didn't just die too quickly. El Chapo ordered his men to brutalize him in all sorts of gruesome ways, which ended in the dismemberment of his limbs, and his remains were later dumped into the Mexican city of Culiacan. On their torture shelf, dismemberment is that brutal tactic showcasing their sheer cruelty that is buried within these cartels. Beheading by chainsaw. In 2011, Felix Garcia and his uncle Barnabas Castro were viciously beheaded. Their demise is one of the first executions by the cartel uploaded for the world to see. Someone in a ski mask carrying a chainsaw, positioning the moving blade to their neck, and you can already guess what's coming up. These men who worked for the notorious Sinaloa cartel made the big mistake of stealing from drug lords. Because of this, they paid the ultimate price with their lives. But this isn't the only gruesome tale we can think of. In August 2008, notorious cartel boss Moses Escamilla May was arrested shortly after he was alleged to have beheaded 12 people in Yucatan, Mexico. These are just a couple of examples, and everyone in and around Mexico knows that getting involved with these cartels is like signing a death sentence. How many movies do you need to see that glorify these tales? But in our digital age now, we have them videotaping their killings and carry out these beheadings like Iraqi insurgents sending out a message to rival gangs or the government. In September 2011, the Mexican police found 5 decomposing heads left in a sack outside of a primary school in Acapulco. Dozens of schools went on strike over security concerns as violence ramped up in the region. 11 years later, on the other side of the country, 5 more decapitated heads were found in an ice cooler in Tamaulipas. These tactics aren't limited to some cartels or regions, but have found application all across Mexico for years. They wouldn't only cut off the head of rival cartel members, they would also attack Mexican journalists who've been critical of their activities, sending a clear message to anyone else who dare to speak out against them. A brutal twist to this practice is that sometimes these beheadings are intertwined with the group's belief system, performed ritually to fulfill religious or spiritual demands. Cannibalism. Cannibalism within the narco world has been an open secret in recent years. The CJ&G, led by Cervantes or El Mencho, has hit the headlines due to these accusations of cannibalism. The CJ&G has become one of the dominant cartels in the country, operating in at least 35 states across Mexico and Puerto Rico. The cartels need to ensure that their recruits can handle these increasing levels of violence mentally. They have to suppress their empathy for those they kill or torture and forget that they too are human beings. So, cannibalism was used as a form of training for recruits to desensitize them to violence and breed fearlessness within them. These shocking public displays of aggression are used to threaten rival groups and show dominance as part of an arsenal of techniques, including demonstrating new weapons and military technologies owned by the group. They're taught how to sever fingers and toes, the cartel's favorite torture technique for interrogating rival gangs. During the training process, recruits have to eat dismembered fingers, and upon passing this trial, they progress to larger body parts. If anyone vomited during this ordeal, instructors would retrieve those regurgitated body parts from the ground and force the individual to ingest them again. Furthermore, these recruits also had to sleep beside deceased bodies at night, aiming to desensitize them to death. Experts suggest that this vicious initiation ritual instilled a warped sense of loyalty to the cartel by dismantling their sense of self-identity. Another well-known example is Miguel Trevino Morales, known as Z40, the former leader of the Zetas. And Miguel had a gruesome habit of consuming the hearts of his victims. He did this as a spiritual ritual, believing it would grant him invincibility against his enemies and authorities. He also did this as a form of warning to rival cartel members. According to a former hitman, Miguel wouldn't only eat these body parts, he would sometimes force other victims to partake in this cruel tradition. Psychological warfare. Contrary to popular opinion, torture isn't always about getting information. Cartels know that most times people will say whatever just to make that pain go away. The real purpose is to scare other people, so no one can go against their wishes. Cartels could make use of their insane psychological torture by keeping victims in small rooms with limited food and water, just making them live in fear, and then would use prolonged isolation with terrifying sounds and images, and even mock executions to break them down physically and emotionally. For the smallest of reasons, some victims would lose a finger and ultimately would have no fingers left. They'd be left afraid of what is to come, and something worse always comes. Their cruelty knew no bounds. Sometimes they would slowly dismember their bodies, or utilize any gruesome torture method they could think of. This gives them the power of intimidation, and they need that power to remain at the top of the chain. A scary thought about these Mexican cartels is that they don't only intimidate the public and their rivals, but sometimes even go after innocent people like the former mayor of Tequicheo, Maria Santos Gorostieta Salazar. In November 2012, Maria was kidnapped by the Knights Templar cartel and made to watch as her husband was burnt alive with a blowtorch and dismembered. She then saw him kill 4 more victims in the same way. Then they proceeded to sexually assault her before they finally decided to kill her. Her autopsy reported that she died of a traumatic head injury. The Mexican cartel combines extreme violence with psychological manipulation to control their victims, using brutal murders as a warning to comply with their demands. Tehuacanazo. February 12, 2019. During the heavily publicized trial of El Chapo, a lot of Sinaloa torture methods were made public, and one of them that stood out was waterboarding. And this is an insane method of punishment, also known as tehuacanazo in Spanish. It involves pouring water on a cloth and placing it over the face of the individual being punished, and you restrict them from breathing. Various forms of waterboarding have been practiced for centuries. It was used in the Spanish Inquisition from the 16th century, by Dutch traders against the British in the 17th century, even the Japanese army during World War II, and by the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia back in the 70s. But despite how many times it's been used in the past, cartels now have added this deadly Mexican twist to it. This torture technique forces the trauma of drowning as well as causing extreme pain to its victims. It causes lung and brain damage, often resulting in oxygen deprivation and, of course, psychological trauma. The Mexican cartels are known to adopt merciless and violent executions for people standing in their way, and this fierce twist is actually making the victim feel a dreadful sensation of drowning. Tehuacanazo really is just waterboarding, but instead of using normal water, the cartel would use carbonated water. In their case, they force the water down the victim's nose, and in more extreme cases, the carbonated water is spiced with chili pepper. The washcloth also makes it 1,000 times worse. As your face is covered, you are filled with fear of drowning, the heavier the cloth feels on your face. To prolong death and increase the torture, cartels pour water intermittently for as long as possible. If the liquid is poured uninterruptedly, it can lead to death. In simpler words, it's torture out of control. Hanging. In 2016, Mexican authorities found a body hanging from a bridge in Tijuana, just 10 miles south of the U.S. border. The San Diego Union Tribune reported that from January to October 2018, the drug trade had caused the loss of more than 1,025 lives in Tijuana. But just to show how regular this insane occurrence has become in the region, November 2021, police pulled 9 bodies down from a bridge in Zacatecas, left as a warning between rival cartels. This was an act of retaliation for the mutilation of 14 men, most likely from Los Zetas, who were found in a minivan in Nuevo Laredo. The bodies were set up around 6 a.m. and were hanging for about 4 hours before the cops came by and pulled them down. Hanging people in public sends a message over the turf in disputed areas. These victims are mutilated, abused, and just hanged carrying signs for all to see. It's not just the cartels that are into this medieval barbarism. These tactics go back to Europe about 500 years ago, and even the Taliban uses it. For Mexican cartels, hanging a rival post-mortem in highly visible places sends a message regarding turf in disputed cities, and these victims are frequently mutilated, showing their signs of abuse. But to the cartels, it doesn't really matter. The more victims they can put up, the more powerful they look to be. A lot of times these victims are recovered bodies of rival members who were involved in a shootout, or even victims that were kidnapped. This execution style shows exactly why most of these killings happen. To show who's boss in the area. The cartel kitchens. Mexican government figures indicate that at least 60,000 people have disappeared since 2006. Yet a 2015 report found only 6 federal court convictions for the crime of forced disappearance. The root cause for most of these disappearances? Cartel kitchens. These infamous cartel Mexican kitchens play a vital and disturbing role in their bloody campaign on the streets. If you step inside, you see bloody handprints on the walls, stained clothes, plastic cable ties, machetes, and, as one person observed, the crunch of bones beneath a thick blanket of ash. This was the scene at La Galleria Ranch in northern Veracruz, which is being operated by the Los Zetas cartel. Now, after that cartel took over the ranch in 2011, it was used to incinerate their victims. The idea was very simple. They would stalk a target for a while, and instead of killing him and leaving the body lying cold-blooded on the street, they would abduct that target and take him to any of their 12 kitchen locations, where they would torture and extract valuable information from him before killing and cooking the bodies. It's been estimated that over 60,000 people have been casualties of cartel kitchens in Mexico alone. These disappearances have been carried out by different crime groups all around, with motives including kidnapping for sex slavery, organ harvesting, forced labor, ransoms, and even repression of political activists and journalists. The Mexican authorities are reported to have gone through mountains of human bones, fragments of teeth, nails, and more, in hopes of identifying hundreds of victims that have been tortured in these kitchens. Anyone finding themselves in one of these kitchens experiences an immense form of psychological torture. At first, you see gruesome sights and the sounds of other victims screaming in pain, which is enough to break even the strongest of hearts before the actual torture starts. Families are upset and frustrated that this kitchen at the ranch is not a recent discovery. Since 2017, they forced authorities to search that property more than 4 times, and each time they've done so, they found things that the previous searches had overlooked. 6 decapitated victims, femurs, pelvises, jawbones, as well as hundreds of other bone fragments, some which were burned, were all discovered during separate searches. If one of your loved ones was caught up in these kitchens, how would you feel about your government?